Hello, gracefully chosen community, and welcome to Foster My Stories, the achievement focused podcast for foster care, adoption, orphan, inclusive of underserved communities. I'm your host, Shalina Michelle Tate, and on today's cast episode, I'm super excited to be speaking to my guest today, Miss Becky DeWitt. How are you doing today?
I am excellent, Shalita.
I'm super excited to have Miss Becky here on Foster My Stories. Before we get into the dynamics of what Miss Becky does and who she is as a powerhouse of a leader, I would love for Miss Becky to tell you, the gracefully chosen listeners, a little bit about her upbringing leading up to who she is today.
Okay, I am, first of all, a child of God. I am somebody who is a local author that God has risen up for such a time. I'm a homegirl, and God has led me to author over 21 titles and like inspiration, contemporary fiction, children's book, different genres. I'm self-published, and I try to write to capture the encounters of everyday practical living or the application of the Word of God in every trial and tribulation. My vision is to pen inspiration and revelation for all generations.
Miss Becky is a dynamic leader. How I met Miss Becky is through a friend who basically was like, hey, you need to reach out to Miss Becky DeWitt. You are an author, and she interviews authors and just different people with different testimonies. And she told me about Miss Becky. I reached out to Miss Becky, and I was super excited when Miss Becky said, hey, come on. And I'm going to let Miss Becky tell us more about her dynamic radio show that I was invited to. Before we get into the radio show, was your upbringing an inspiration for much of what you do now? Or did you see stuff in the community as you grew that you wanted to change? What's your story?
I think that my upbringing from a single mother, my father died when I was 7.
Okay.
So I was raised by the village. The village does not play.
Yes.
And so being raised by the village, you had to have a determination. You had to do something. You had to be something. And you have to be more than what your parents were. Okay?
Yes.
So the village had an idea for me. I went to law school for a year. My uncle had a firm. I was supposed to come out and be a lawyer. Can you imagine? I would have been Judge Becky. About me, I like to say, a very checkered life. When I say checkered, that means that God had so gifted me in his design and uniqueness that wherever you put me, I fit. And not only did I survive, but I exceeded and excelled. Okay?
Yes.
So I dropped out of law school, much to the, oh my God, of the village. And I decided to be a flight attendant with Delta. The village had a plan for me, but that was not God's plan. I ended up living in New York and working on Wall Street, all sorts of things. But wherever God has me so uniquely designed that whatever I decided to do before checking with him, I would succeed and excel. But now that I've checked in with him, I'm doing what he says. I'm kingdom busy.
Yes, Miss Becky definitely is kingdom focused, kingdom leader. I like how you were transparent about the fact that, and a lot of times that is so true, especially in our childhoods. A lot of times others have a plan. They've already planned out your life or expectations of your life as we grow. And I know for me, as I'm growing, I'm discovering that, others' expectations of me is not really the final and not necessarily be where I need to be, but that divine nudge that God has a divine purpose for our lives. Then we kind of have to shift. When was that for you? Was that earlier on as you was coming law school? Did you get that, okay, this is not the direction you need to go? Or was that like life experiences?
I would think it's life experiences because the village said I was rebellious.
Yes.
Okay. So I just was going, whatever at the time. And I wasn't a born again Christian at the time.
Yes, yes.
I've been born again 30 years. So now I'm seeking to do what God wants me to do for his design.
Yes.
Because he designed me uniquely for a purpose as he's released me and wrapped me in flesh to be on the planet.
Yes.
Now, all before, I was just like, oh, I want to do this. I'm going to try that. And I'm going to do that. Da, da, da. And I wasn't sticking to the plan of the village. Okay?
Yes.
Be honest, I kind of wanted to be the lawyer thing. I got into law school in the late 70s at the University of South Carolina, where, not too many African American females got in.
Yes.
Okay, I did get in. Could have stayed, but I just decided one day, I want to be a flight attendant. I want to leave the area. I want to do things. And so God, allowed me to move and do. So I would say that my life experiences, he allowed me to you go ahead and do what you want now. But at some point in time, you're going to come back and do what I want.
Yes, listeners, that's a very real thing Miss Becky's talking about. And of course, each of us individually have to come to that nudge for ourselves and wanting to align with that nudge. And of course, we all have voices to make as we grow. But I like how Miss Becky's being transparent about the fact that, you know what, she wanted to shift. She didn't want to stay in that, okay, I have to line up with what others thought or appease anyone. I'm wanting to go this direction because this is divine and this is what I think is right. Miss Becky, as you entered being a flight attendant, how was that? Was that the start of meeting people, ministering to people, or did you get that nudge later on?
The nudge to meet people, yes, invite attendance. I always thought that there's something bigger, there's something better. This is
Yes.
just not it for me.
Yes.
Okay, coming from a small town in Conway, Myrtle Beach area in South Carolina, and I even worked on Wall Street.
Yes.
Okay, I worked at brokerage firms, and so I just, God had always gifted me with the ability, and through personality, I always knew with something bigger.
Yes.
But when I got born again, I would say that nudge came even deeper because when I got born again, I had no idea that I would be writing books, over 20 years of books. And the thing about it is, now that I think about it, I got a couple of friends that when we were in sixth grade, write episodes based on the show The Monkees. This is way before a whole lot of people's time. That was in
Yes.
black and white on television.
Yeah.
So, we laugh about it today. Now that I have the revelation, I was writing in sixth grade.
Okay.
I had vision in sixth grade. Even as I think about it, when I worked on my master's and I wrote several grants for different things, I've always been writing. That was always in the design.
Yes.
But it wasn't until I came to Christ to understand that was the design. That's what the purpose was. And so now I'm pursuing that to the fullest extent. To answer your question, the nudge came after I got the revelation of who I really am and my true identity.
Miss Becky definitely has this dynamic group that encourages and motivates aspiring authors. Miss Becky, could you tell the listeners about Blood Drop Inheritance Group and then also what led you into doing your radio show and how that's helped so many people?
Well, Blood Drop Inheritance Group, I always said that I was going to have a company, and my company was going to be an umbrella, right? And really, I think that they come from God. That's just Becky McDonald's. I got to come. What I'm going to do with the company? And that was the beginning of that thought. And the Blood Drop Inheritance Group I used to publish my books.
Okay.
Right? I was selfish. And so my cousin told me years ago, Becky, you need to help other people. I was selfish.
Okay.
And I had a little boy. His grandmother sent me a short story. So last year I began publishing other people's books, a couple of children's books. I published a book for a guy in Nigeria and
Yes.
prayer book. So, I'm very selective,
Yes.
but I don't mind help. So now the Ready Writers came about is because somebody wanted to have me to have a radio show. I had lined up authors and everything ready to go, and it did not pan out. I asked God, I said, God, I got this stuff ready. My name is on the line. And the Lord led me to YouTube. I learned how to make my own videos, but the premise and the basic is to interview those writers that God has given the gift of writing, and not only the gift of writing, but the gift of a message
Yes.
that nobody knows about. So because we are here, the words that God give us, the pen are the opportunity for a possibility. That is our tagline. Plus, you are here to make a mark that cannot be erased. So we do the Ready Writers show. It's on YouTube. I don't know who's going to watch. So sometimes the books that people are writing are definitely inspirational to somebody somewhere. You have a voice.
Yes.
Your books are a voice as well as your physical voice. So somebody is assigned to hear and to read what you've written.
Listeners, as you can hear, Miss Becky is definitely profound in the words and the wisdom that God has given her. And I love how she expressed that the vision is to continue assisting those who have a vision to write and leave a word for the future generations. And it's been a privilege. Once again, that's how I met Miss Becky. I went on her radio show and not knowing it would lead to much more, but Miss Becky has been definitely an inspiration to myself, and I know a lot of others. I enjoyed her excitement all the time and just being on her show and just the energy, and it inspired me, listeners. It really did. Speaking with Miss Becky and definitely the group G Level group, God-led group, to also look into podcasting. That's how I got my start. I was inspired by Miss Becky. I see that you said the obstacles, especially for children, you just want to keep pushing them and really want others to hear their stories. Could you tell us about that with the young author that you worked with, the opportunities to be able to help others tell their stories?
One of the things about children's the
Yes.
pandemic,
Yes.
all of these political things, the racial overtones. There is just so much that's going on.
Yes.
So we don't know really until we listen what is going on with children. So involvement, if you're not really involved, if you're not really paying attention, a lot of children are committing suicide. What in the world is going on?
Yeah.
8 and 9 year olds, when I was growing
Mm.
up, and I don't mind telling my age, I'm retirement age, okay? Social Security age, okay? No one did that.
Yeah.
No one did that. So a lot of times children are going through things in the home
Yeah.
and they have nobody to talk to. So things are bottled up inside.
Yes.
So it was an honor, even if it's a short story, they're just saying a couple things and that's their vision and that's their imagination.
Yes.
But the involvement of listening, okay? Sometimes I had a little girl that I wanted to publish her book ever since last year, and parents weren't really that involved.
Okay. Yes.
And so we came back with some suggestions and everything, and
Yeah.
it's been held up. It was on the back burner
Oh.
because I had planned to have that done by Christmas. So that's another thing.
Yes.
Involvement.
Yes.
You have to see the gift. I saw that gift. They called me about her a year before, and I said, we need to do this. And they relaxed,
Yeah.
but I saw the gift in this child.
Yes.
Oh my God, some children are waiting for you to see the gift in them.
Yes.
They have to have somebody that would see and believe and help pull it out, help bring it to pass.
Yes. Yes.
So that, involvement can be an obstacle.
Yes, I highly agree with what Miss Becky is saying. I love how God has gifted her to use books to help children to have positive outlets because that's so true. I work at a charter school and I also work at a theater company, and it's so important to be involved and, like Miss Becky was saying, listening to the youth and meeting them right where they are. A lot of people want to just isolate the youth and medicate the youth up, but that's not always what they need. A lot of times, like Miss Becky was saying, they need someone to listen. And a lot of times, their outlets may very well be writing, singing, dancing, expression. But if they don't have the right mentors or the right individuals that's pouring into them or seeing the gifts that's in them, then they can get lost. I love how you was expressing you had no training, but you just want to spread the word. And I, of course, know that that's just gifts that God has given you. How has spreading the word through your books and your companies grown over the years with individuals and with the youth?
God has gifted me with that unique ability to write and to
Yes.
speak to someone and wherever they are and just spreading the word, even writing children's books. You just have to be in a place where you can listen to God for the download.
Yeah.
I wrote this trilogy, and I didn't even think about it being a trilogy, Destiny's Closet, years ago.
Yes.
And it's been more than a decade. I got it at a church conference because I had to sit at the table with the children and everybody else was sitting with the pastor, which is a place everybody jockeys for. And I had to sit with the children. But as I sat with the children, I listened. And when I listened, they were talking about people in church and what we do, all of the things and how we act and the characteristics. And I got an idea for a book. And it was 5 short stories. I put it online and he told me to pull it off. And it was a book. One book turned into two. Then it turned into three. So I was writing from a child's perspective.
Yes.
And that is an awesome thing. In order to write from a child's perspective, you have to have a child's eyes.
Yes.
Recently, I was working on a children's book, and somebody sent me an adult book, and I had to tell them I can't look at that because I am working on the child's book and having to view the child's eyes.
Yes.
That's a way that we spread the word. We take everyday experiences, everyday trials, everyday tribulations, everyday, no matter what level, no matter what generation, and try to apply the word of God and find the best out of it, find the peace of it, and find the redemption of it.
So true, Miss Becky. Just listening and just finding the right outlet. And listeners, if you would love to work with Miss Becky, email you at blooddropinheritance@gmail.com.
They can email you. You can forward them to me.
Email me as well, listeners, at Shelena Tate, that's SHELENATATE @outlook.com. And of course, I can connect as well. Of course, any connections will be led by God. Before we go, Miss Becky, is there any words of wisdom or advice you would love to give listeners who are possibly inspiring authors or who may have children that are gifted and they're wanting advice or who desire to also be God-led as leaders in the marketplace?
I would say find what you are gifted in and work your vision. Don't give up. Keep it moving. Help will come.
Honored to have had Miss Becky here on the podcast. Not only is she a dynamic author, but she's a producer, definitely a thought-provoking leader, and a minister who has encouraged me on my journey and many others. If you would love to be a guest here on Fostered My Stories as a featured story, a community guest, or a special guest that's relative to the foster care, adoption, orphaned, or underserved communities, you can, like Miss Becky said, email me at ShalenaTate@Outlook.com and tune in Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear new content via Red Circle, Spotify, Radio Public, Google Podcasts, and Amazon Audible. And remember, being fostered, adopted, orphaned, and underserved simply means you're gracefully chosen. Miss Becky, you have a dynamic rest of your day, and thank you for being my guest here on Foster My Stories.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Listeners, have a dynamic rest of your day.